realized that they had to bring stability. The concept of arms control came into play. The clock fluctuated over the years. When I started in 1984, the clock was set at, I think, around 3 minutes. By the time I finished started my arms control work in 1988, optimistically, the clock was pushed back. Why? Because we were getting rid of nuclear weapons. By 1991, the clock had been set to 17 minutes before midnight. People talked openly about the prospect of the end of the concept of nuclear Armageddon, but that was not to be. Today, the clock stands at 90 seconds. That is the closest the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has ever set the clock to this theoretical midnight. But it is not a theoretical midnight. Today, the world faces the prospect of imminent nuclear conflict. We are closer to nuclear conflict today than we have been at any time in the nuclear era. We are in greater danger of a nuclear war than we were at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why? Because the United States has foolishly and dangerously allowed the Ukrainian government to use weapons provided by the United States to Ukraine to strike targets inside Russia. In December of 2021, before this conflict began, Russia had submitted a draft treaty to the United States and to NATO where they talked about new European security frameworks. They talked about the conditions to resolve the dispute over Ukraine peacefully without resorting to military force. One of the things that the Russians let their American counterparts know is that NATO would never be allowed to absorb Ukraine. And one of the reasons is that if NATO ever placed its long-range ballistic missiles on Ukrainian soil, that would place Russia's strategic nuclear capabilities at risk of preemptive attack. The command and control centers, early warning radars, the actual missile sites. This is why Russia has drawn a red line, famously described in a memorandum written by then U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, in 2008 as the "Niet means niet, no means no." Ukraine would never be allowed to become part of NATO. And yet today, because of the United States, because of NATO, long-range American missiles are on Ukrainian soil. And the United States has given Ukraine permission to use these missiles to strike targets in Russia. Targets that include, at least potentially, nuclear command and control centers, nuclear weapons storage facilities, early warning radars, and the actual nuclear delivery systems themselves. This is an existential crisis for Russia, one which, if called upon to respond, they will do so in a way that reflects the danger of the situation that's been thrust upon them. Russia has talked about using nuclear weapons to strike targets not in Ukraine, but in Europe against NATO and potentially against the United States. 90 seconds to midnight. That's wrong. The truth is we are 1 millisecond from midnight. All it takes is one ATACMS missile being launched by Ukraine with this assistance and guidance of the United States to strike the wrong target inside Russia, and the world will end. That's where we are today. The most dangerous situation the world has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1963. President Putin made it clear that he understands how these systems work. Therefore, that means that the Russians understand what needs to be targeted. Locations not only inside Ukraine, but on the soil of NATO members. Now, the NATO members and NATO itself will claim that this support of Ukraine is being done by sovereign states, not by NATO as an entity. So when Russia retaliates against the sovereign states, NATO better not rally around these nations and suddenly proclaim Article 5 collective self-defense protections. Because if they do that, then it's clear that this is a NATO confrontation against Russia. And if NATO chooses then to respond by launching additional attacks against Russia, remember, these aren't retaliation attacks. Russia is retaliating against NATO attacks against its territory. This would be an all-out assault by NATO against Russia, and former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev made it clear that the Russian response would be nuclear, and this would lead to a general nuclear exchange in the end of the world. That's where we're at right now. This isn't about helping Ukraine. This isn't about Ukraine defending itself. This is about a larger plan by the collective West, by NATO, by the United States to strategically defeat Russia. Now, in some ways, Russia is to blame here. Let me say why. Because Russia continuously says that it is seeking a peaceful solution. Russia continuously indicates it is looking for a negotiated settlement. These Russian postures, which are very reasonable, are being misinterpreted in the West as a sign of Russian weakness. And therefore, the collective determination of the West is that they just continue to pressure Russia, ratchet up the pressure that Russia will fold like a house of cards and run to the peace table and bring an end to this conflict. That's not going to happen. This is a misreading of the situation by the West. And so the West now will attack Russia, trying to pressure Russia to the peace table. But all it will do is guarantee a Russian response that if the West doesn't respond properly to that, if the West thinks that it therefore has the right to strike Russia in return, will lead to Armageddon, the end of the world. That's where we're at today. This isn't a game. This isn't a joke. This is the end of all humanity. And I'm not exaggerating right now. You literally just had a major Russian. You had Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, a senior national security advisor to Vladimir Putin, basically put Europe on notice. We are going to nuke you. We are going to nuke you. There is no question about it. If you do what you say you're going to do, we are going to drop nuclear bombs on you. And we will also nuke America, because he said there are targets that we can't reach with our tactical nuclear weapons. So the strategic component will come into play. Hello, America. You've just become a nuclear target overnight. You didn't know that? What do you think was happening? You're all focused on Donald Trump being convicted on 34 felony accounts. Why weren't you focused on the Biden administration saying we just greenlit Ukraine using American long-range weapons to strike targets inside Russia, understanding that none of those targets can function unless they've been programmed with the targeting data by American technicians receiving intelligence data from American satellites transmitted by American armed forces, that America is attacking Russia as we speak. ATACMS missiles hit the Russian bridge in Crimea. And the Russians have said, you can't do that. That's like Russia using missiles to strike the Tappan Zee Bridge, or what used to be known as the Como Bridge or the Verrazano Straits Bridge. We wouldn't allow that to happen, but we just allowed Ukraine to use our weapons, which we targeted, to strike a bridge. And this is going to lead to an inevitable retaliation. And Russia has said, we are going to hit you. And it's not going to be in Ukraine. The nations that are responsible for this will be struck. And then if they decide to implement Article 5 and make it a NATO thing and strike Russia, the next step is that Russia will immediately respond with nuclear weapons. Immediately respond. There's not going to be a phone call. There's not going to be, time for people to debate it on TV. It's just going to go boom. And it's all over. And this is happening right now as we speak. The decision-making cycles are in play as we speak. I may not even get on an airplane, because the world could come to an end right now, today. Give us a chance. Don't give up on us, because right now the big danger in Russia isn't that they're going to go to war with us tomorrow. I mean, that, of course, is a big danger. But the Russians don't want to go to war. They really don't want to go to war. Why would they? Vladimir Putin just spent a quarter century rebuilding Russia into this wonderful country that it is today, that I'm going to try and capture and bring back and show the American people. The Russians aren't suicidal. As I said, they want the same things you and I want. They want to raise their family in peace. They want a better future for their children. They want jobs. They want, a life that's worth living. Why would you throw that away with nuclear war? So it's not that the Russians are bending over backwards trying to go to war with America, but even if we can avoid this nuclear conflict today, the Russians, I think, are just starting to say America doesn't matter to us anymore. That rather than try and work with America, we're going to work without America, that we're just not going to deal with America. There's nothing constructive that comes from relationships with America. And while I understand the Russian position, that's a dangerous thing for both them and us. When nations don't talk, we come back to the basic principle of what I'm trying to accomplish here, which is to overcome ignorance-based fear. If we stop talking to one another in both nations, what will happen is we will not know what the other side's thinking, doing. And that creates ignorance, that creates fear. And now we'll have two nuclear armed powers living in fear of one another at a moment when the world's going through this transition from American hegemony to a multilateral existence that America finds many Americans, government officials view as an existential threat. So if we're not communicating with the Russians, this transition could lead to people believing that Russia's a threat worthy of war. And now we're back to that creation of war. Russia needs to maintain connectivity with America. But in order to